The challenge was issued in a small studio. "Can you play it clean? No distortion?" Jimi Hendrix didn't answer. He placed his fingers on the strings. And the silence that followed changed everything. New York City. Spring of 1968. A recording studio on West 48th Street, 3rd floor, barely larger than a living room. The kind of space where studio musicians gathered after midnight, when the paid sessions ended and real music began. There were maybe 8 people in the room. Session players, mostly. Jazz cats who'd been playing clubs for 20 years. Men who'd backed Coltrane, who'd toured with Mingus, who knew theory the way other people knew breathing. And Jimi Hendrix, sitting on a wooden stool near the window, his Stratocaster resting across his lap like a sleeping child. He wasn't supposed to be there. Someone had brought him, a friend of a friend, the way these things happened. The jazz musicians had been polite. Respectful, even. They knew who he was. The British Invasion Kid. The Monterey Sensation. The guy who played guitar with his teeth and set it on fire. Entertainment. Spectacle. Not serious music. Raymond Cole was the oldest man in the room. 63. Saxophone player. Had recorded with Bird in 52. Had played every club worth playing. His hands were gnarled with arthritis now, but his tone was still pure. Clean. Precise. He'd been listening to the younger players jam for the past hour. Blues progressions mostly. Standard changes. Nothing challenging. Then someone mentioned Hendrix. Said he was in town. Said maybe he'd stop by. Raymond had smiled. Bring him. Let's see what all the fuss is about. When Jimmy walked in 2 hours later, Raymond had watched him move through the room. Quiet. Almost shy. Not the wild man from the magazine covers. Just a young guy in a simple shirt and jeans, carrying his guitar like it was the only thing in the world that made sense to him. They'd played for a while. Blues. Some standards. Jimmy sat in the back, barely audible, adding texture behind the leads. Supporting. Not pushing. Raymond had been impressed despite himself. The kid had touch. Knew when not to play. That was rare. But then someone had called for a break. People stepped out to smoke. Raymond stayed, adjusting his reed. And Jimmy stayed too, still on that wooden stool, still holding his guitar. "You play loud," Raymond said. Not accusatory. Just observation. Jimmy looked up. "Sometimes. All that distortion. All those effects. You ever play clean? Just the instrument and the amp?" Jimmy's expression didn't change. "Sometimes." Raymond set down his saxophone. "I ask because real musicians, jazz musicians, we play clean. We don't hide behind volume. Behind tricks. You want to know if someone can really play, you strip everything away. Just them and their instrument." Jimmy nodded slowly. "Makes sense. So can you? Play clean, I mean. No distortion. No feedback. No fire and theatrics. Just music." The room wasn't empty anymore. The other musicians had filtered back in, sensing something. They stood near the walls, near the control room window, watching. Jimmy looked at his guitar. Then at Raymond. Then back at his guitar. "How do you want it?" he asked quietly. "Clean," Raymond repeated. "Show me what you've got when you can't hide." Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Jimmy reached down and adjusted the settings on his amplifier. Turned everything down. No distortion. No reverb. No effects. Just a pure, direct signal. The way jazz players had been amplifying for decades. He returned to his stool. Positioned the guitar. His left hand found the neck. His right hand hovered over the strings. He didn't look at Raymond. Didn't look at anyone. He played a single note. It hung in the air. Pure. Clean. Perfectly intonated. Not loud, but somehow filling every molecule of space in that small room. The note had weight. Had texture. Had something that made everyone forget to breathe. Then a second note. Different finger position. Same impossible clarity. The sustain was natural, no pedals, no tricks, just the resonance of wood and wire and human intention. The two notes together created an interval. Not a common one. Not something from the standard jazz vocabulary. But mathematically perfect. Emotionally undeniable. Jimmy built a chord. 4 notes, voiced in a way that shouldn't work on paper but sounded like truth. His fingers barely moved. Each note was allowed to breathe before the next arrived. No rushing. No showing off. Just deliberate, inevitable progression. Raymond Cole had played saxophone for 41 years. He had perfect pitch. He could hear the difference between in tune and slightly sharp from 3 rooms away. He knew theory the way priests knew scripture. And he had never heard anyone voice a chord like that. Jimmy wasn't playing progressions. Wasn't playing scales. He was playing the spaces between notes. The implications. The suggestions. Each sound led to the next not through theory but through some kind of emotional logic that bypassed the brain entirely and went straight to the thing that makes humans weep at beauty. The tempo was impossibly slow. Meditative. Each note was given time to live and die before the next was born. In the silence between sounds, Jimmy's face remained serene. Eyes half closed. No strain. No effort visible. Just a man having a conversation with an instrument that seemed to understand him completely. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. The younger musicians stood frozen. One had his mouth open, forgetting to close it. Another had pulled out a notepad and started to write down what he was hearing, then realized notation couldn't capture this and put the pen down. Raymond sat in his chair, his saxophone forgotten across his knees, watching Hendrix's left hand. The finger positions were unconventional. Wrong by academic standards. But the sound they produced was undeniable. This wasn't rock and roll. This wasn't blues. This was something older and newer simultaneously. Modal implications over drone tones. Harmonic movement that suggested jazz sophistication but came from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere intuitive rather than studied. Jimmy played for maybe 90 seconds. No more. Each phrase built on the previous, creating a narrative without words. Tension without resolution, then resolution without cliché. The final note, played with his thumb, a technique Raymond had never seen on electric guitar, rang out and faded naturally, no artificial sustain, just the honest decay of vibrating metal. Then silence. Real silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something too large to immediately process. Jimmy opened his eyes. Looked at his guitar. Adjusted one tuning peg by perhaps a quarter turn, though nothing had sounded out of tune. Then he looked at Raymond. "Clean enough?" he asked quietly. Raymond Cole didn't answer immediately. Couldn't. Something had shifted in the room. In him. He'd spent 40 years believing that mastery came from conservatory training. From studying with the masters. From learning theory and structure and proper technique. From paying dues in small clubs and big bands and endless rehearsals. And this kid, this rock and roll kid with his wild hair and his unconventional grip, had just played 90 seconds that contained more musical truth than Raymond had managed in some entire performances. "Where did you study?" Raymond finally asked. "Didn't," Jimmy said. "Taught myself." "Who showed you those voicings?" "Nobody. Just, what sounds right." Raymond looked at his saxophone. At the instrument he'd mastered through discipline and repetition and decades of deliberate practice. Then back at Hendrix, who held his guitar like they'd been born together. "Play something else," Raymond said. Not a challenge anymore. A request. Almost a plea. Jimmy shook his head gently. "Your turn." In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. He stood up. Walked over to Raymond. And extended his guitar toward the older man. "Show me something," Jimmy said. "On this." Show me how you hear things. The room went completely still. Raymond stared at the offered Stratocaster. I don't play guitar. You play music, Jimmy said simply. Instrument doesn't matter. Show me how you think. I want to learn. It was the most disarming thing he could have done. No ego in it. No condescension. Just genuine interest. Genuine respect. Raymond's hands were shaking slightly as he took the guitar. Arthritis made his fingers stiff, but he managed to form a basic chord. G major. Simple. The sound that came out was clean but unremarkable. He tried to move to C, fumbled slightly, got there eventually. It sounded like what it was, a saxophone player trying to play guitar. Jimmy knelt beside the chair, watching Raymond's finger positions. The shapes you're using, they're piano shapes translated. Saxophone thinks in fifths. Guitar's built in fourths. Different logic. He gently adjusted Raymond's left hand. Showed him a different way to voice the same chord. Try this. Raymond played it. The chord suddenly had depth. Resonance. It breathed. Oh, Raymond said softly. For the next 20 minutes, Jimi Hendrix knelt on the floor of that studio and taught Raymond Cole, a man 40 years his senior, a man who had challenged him, a man who represented everything Jimmy wasn't supposed to be, how to think guitaristically. Not by showing off. Not by proving anything. By giving. By sharing. By approaching the exchange with the assumption that everyone in the room, regardless of age or experience or background, had something to teach and something to learn. The other musicians gradually sat down, picked up their instruments. Someone started a slow blues progression. Jimmy returned to his stool, his guitar back in his hands. Raymond picked up his saxophone. They played together. No competition. No ego. Just music. And in that small studio on West 48th Street, something happened that would be talked about for years afterward. Not because it was loud or flashy or dramatic, but because a room full of professionals, men who thought they understood mastery, learned that real mastery doesn't need to prove itself. It just is. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. The session ended near dawn. People drifted out slowly, reluctant to break the spell. Raymond was the last to leave besides Jimmy. He packed his saxophone carefully, then turned at the door. I was wrong, he said simply. Jimmy looked up from where he was coiling his guitar cable. About what? I thought you hid behind effects. Behind volume. I thought if you stripped that away, there'd be nothing underneath. And now? Raymond smiled, tired but genuine. Now I think the effects hide how good you really are. You could play a ukulele in a closet and it would still be you. Jimmy returned the smile. You ever want to record something, let me know. I'd like to hear what you do when you're not proving yourself to anyone. Proving myself? Raymond frowned. I wasn't. He stopped. Realized. I wasn't I? For 40 years. Makes the music smaller, Jimmy said gently. Not wrong. Just smaller than it could be. Raymond Cole went home that morning and didn't play saxophone for 3 days. Just sat with his instrument and thought about why he'd spent 40 years trying to prove something instead of just saying something. When he picked it up again, people who heard him play said something had changed. They couldn't identify what. Just that Raymond Cole suddenly sounded like he'd found something he'd been searching for his entire life. He never saw Jimi Hendrix again. 2 years later the news came. Raymond was in Chicago, playing a club date, when someone told him Jimmy had died in London. Raymond excused himself mid-set. Went to the alley behind the club. And cried for 20 minutes, mourning not just a musician but a teacher who had taught without teaching, who had challenged without confronting, who had shown mastery by demonstrating that mastery doesn't need to be demonstrated. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. 40 years later, in a radio interview 3 months before his own death, Raymond Cole was asked about his proudest musical moment. He didn't mention the albums, the tours with legends, the standing ovations. There was a night in '68, he said quietly. Small studio. Kid with a guitar taught me that I'd been asking the wrong question my whole life. What question? The interviewer asked. I kept asking, can I prove I'm good enough? The right question is, can I say something true? He paused. Jimi Hendrix never tried to prove anything. That's why he proved everything. Raymond kept one photograph on his music stand for the rest of his life. A blurry snapshot someone had taken that night. Jimi kneeling on the floor beside Raymond's chair, both of them looking at the guitar, both of them learning. When Raymond died, they found a note tucked inside his saxophone case, written in his own shaky handwriting. Real mastery is making others better. Thank you, Jimi. The note stayed with the instrument. It's in a museum now. Some people visit to see the saxophone. Others come to read what real mastery looks like when it's finally understood.